Hi, everybody. Welcome. The College of Fine and Performing Arts in the Western Gallery and the WWU Alumni Association are excited to welcome you to today's webinar. How has COVID-19 impacted your artistic practice? My name is Tammy Landis, and I'm the museum educator at the Western Gallery. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists today, who consists of alums Debbie Knote, Sheldon Sabatini, Quentin Maldonado, Shannon Delorio, soon-to-be graduate Nicole Sletta, and our moderator, Chris Vargas. So now what I'd like, we're gonna have some images of each of these artists' work, and they're gonna just take a quick moment to introduce themselves. So if we can get those images up, and as they go up. So Quentin, first up, quick introduction.
Hi there, I'm Quentin Maldonado. I graduated from Western in 2015, currently based in Philadelphia, where I graduated from the Tyler School of Art in 2020. Currently, I work on a lot of video art, sound art things.
Great, thank you, Quentin.
Hi, I'm Nicole Sletta. I'm currently a Western student. I plan on graduating this March. I'm outside of the Western Gallery right now, and in my current practice, I've created this creature called the Yeti Squatch, which is kind of my quarantine buddy, and the photo you're looking at right now is its cabin.
Hi everyone, my name is Debbie Knote. I am an artist based in Brooklyn, New York. I graduated from Western Washington University with my BFA in 2014. I then moved to New York City and finished my master's in sculpture in 2016. I now live and work here, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Debbie.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sheldon Sabatini. I got my BFA in studio art photography in 2003, which I believe makes me the old man of the group. I'm currently a commercial photographer and director located in Portland, Oregon.
Thank you, Sheldon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Delorio. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I graduated from the BFA program last year in June 2020 from Western. My culminating series included 5 4x4 foot oil paintings where I portrayed different perspectives of my bed, utilizing a dollhouse-sized replica that I constructed and documented. I'm currently still in Bellingham working and painting when I can.
Thank you, Shannon. And I should note, Shannon's year in particular was most impacted by the BFA program by COVID-19. So Shannon, I'm sure, will reveal how some of that year went. Thank you all. It's great to have such an array of panelists today and artists, you know, coming from different times at Western, and to see where you're all at. So we're gonna get started, but a little housekeeping first. Some of you in the audience have submitted questions with your registration. Thank you for doing that. We will get to those as we move through our discussion today. If you have any additional questions, please use the Zoom Q&A feature, which is the bottom middle of your screen, to send us any questions that might come to mind. And when we have a good moment, we'll address that. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we would love to see you participate and chime in to what stands out to you or what you'd like us to dive into further. And we will do our best to respond to those throughout this discussion. But let's go ahead and get started. I know we have a lot to jump into, so I'm going to hand things over to Chris, who's moderating this conversation today. So Chris, I will let you jump off with that first question.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad to be moderating. I am a professor in the art department, in case you don't know. I teach mainly classes related to time-based media. And I know, I at least overlapped with 3 of you. So my first question, and this one, I'll just start us off with Sheldon, maybe the oldest or the furthest out than the rest of the group. But so in your respective practice, and this is going to be for the rest of you too, but I'll just start with Sheldon. How have you had to shift your career and your work related to the pandemic? And so maybe start with what you were doing right when it started March 2020 and how it's been impacted in the following months.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It was definitely a big change. 2019 was my busiest and biggest year of my career. And so I went from a pretty wild, really busy year where I traveled a lot, worked on a lot of different projects all over the world. And then those carried over a little bit into the beginning of 2020. Typically, the first quarter slows down in my industry. And then the pandemic hit and my full calendar completely wiped away and went on hold. Jobs they'd push for a week, push for 2 weeks, and everybody, I think, had the hope that things would turn around quickly. And behind the scenes, we were making plans for, well, what happens if it doesn't? And so big productions where, dozens of people are traveling around to do these projects, they get very expensive really fast if you're not actually shooting and not getting the content that you're supposed to be getting. And so they pulled the plug on most things after a few weeks. And then I shifted to being a little more home-based here. I have a studio outside of Portland. And so I obviously wasn't traveling during the pandemic, especially in the early days. And my clients I was lucky enough that I could set up my studio to do remote viewing and things like that, and finish out what projects that I could. And then, we kept going throughout the year.
Thanks for that, Sheldon. How about for you, Debbie?
Hey everyone. I guess it's been an interesting time. It's funny because before the pandemic hit, I was actually traveling a bunch. So I was kind of living in this world of endless possibility. I was in Iceland for 2 months in a little town called Skagastrand for an artist residency. And then I went straight from there to Cadiz in southern Spain. So I was making work in a different place and meeting different people. And then I came back to the US and stayed in Washington for December. And then January 1st was back in New York, ready to hit the ground running with all this new work and, all these experiences and warmth from international travel. And then it was like a month later that the whispers started to happen and people started to get concerned. And so it changed a lot. I remember being at Spring Break Art Fair, which is a big emerging art fair in New York City, and you were starting to see like the elbows instead of the handshake and things like that. So from there, things really changed. I ended up losing my job in June, which I was managing an artist studio, and so I had a lot of introspective time. I started making smaller works. I actually moved my art studio, which is usually in a separate space from my home. I moved at home and I started making smaller works on paper. It changed my practice a lot. And I think, looking back, it wasn't necessarily a good or bad change. It was just introspective. And a lot of the works actually didn't end up getting finished. And I think maybe that's how a lot of us felt about that time, that it was, that it didn't quite have any conclusion. It just sort of happened.
And just to follow up, are you finding that you're picking up some of that work that you put down at the beginning of the pandemic now, or is it still?
Yeah. I actually had one really big painting. It's like 75 by 63 inches. And I ended up, I redid the painting, but there are elements that came through that I'm really happy with. And work-wise, things are starting to open up again, which has been nice. that's how it goes.
Yeah. Quentin, and you graduated in 2015 and went to grad school. And if I remember correctly, part of this, maybe this overlapped, or March 2020 either overlapped with at the ending of your time in grad school. Is that correct?
Yes, very
Yeah.
close. I had
What?
just had my like MFA thesis show only a couple weeks prior, and so lucked out that I had signed up like for the second week in that respect, even though it drove me a little bit insane. But that's also like the experience of grad school. It's pretty wild in that way. It's lots of reading and emotional turmoil. But I like the work a lot. Though I was doing a lot of installation based work, like with sound and light and things. That was much more experiential. And then because of the pandemic, like pretty much had to put that body of work to rest for the moment. But I had started doing video in my final year as well. And so at least had something that felt like a natural transition to be able to do on my computer during all of it.
Were people able to actually see your thesis show?
Yes, my
Oh,
mom
good.
flew out, and it was wonderful. And then it was
Good.
like, riding high, grad school is about to end, successful show. There's no way that literally anything bad could happen. And yeah, was proven quite foolish in that respect.
Yeah, and I'm sure that your post grad school was a lot different than you imagined.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the shutting down of everything was very surreal, and like leaving with this sort of like the idea of education as this kind of like promise in some sort of way uh, into a world where like there wasn't really a lot going on. We're still not exactly sure where all the pieces are going to fall as the world reopens at this moment. But like, I think I don't know. I think it was very enlightening in its own way as well because it helped me put a number of things into perspective about like going through the process of like undergrad and then graduate school in art and then coming out into this world in which like the market was like semi-closed, like thinking about like my relationship with my practice and like the health of it and also just sort of the care in which like approaching it. I think it was a very enlightening time to sort of like come into those sorts of perspectives.
That's a really positive approach to have taken to that transitional period. And Shannon, you kind of had a similar situation in that you had you had a very different situation in that your BFA exhibition was delayed a number of months. But yeah, will you talk about that kind of what it was like? Sorry, going back to the question, what you were doing prior to the shutdown in 2020 and how, that impacted your following months after leaving Western.
Yeah, totally. Prior to March, I was finishing up winter quarter of the BFA program where I had finally like refined my scope. Like I was starting on my big paintings and like kind of trying to bust them out for the show. So it was very difficult to suddenly have like a wall in front of me and my entire cohort where everything suddenly became an unknown. And I think it's just difficult when, I mean, a lot of us experience this, like you worked so hard for something and then for it not to happen or not to happen the way you wanted to. I don't know. It creates like a huge lack of motivation. So yeah, it was an interesting time and like difficult to navigate like the bureaucracy of like Western and trying to put on a show or even trying to have access to our studios. Like there were a few weeks where we couldn't even work on our stuff, like especially those of us with bigger pieces or like installations. So I think like it definitely forced myself and a lot of us to adapt. I feel like that's like the buzzword of the year. But yeah, luckily, I mean, I'm so thankful for our staff, like our BFA head, Lisa Turner, Tammy, like Julia Sapin. I mean, those people advocated for us, and that's the reason why in the fall we were able to have our show. So yeah, I mean, through it all, I feel like for me, I think I was putting a lot of weight on the exhibition, on like working toward this show like in a professional setting, which was like a first for me. And I feel like my biggest lesson was that the most important part of the program was me making my art and like becoming a better painter and just making connections with my cohort and like the staff. And I don't know. So I try to focus on that and not on what we lost, which a lot of us lost a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Shannon. And Nicole, you are currently still here, but I remember March 2020, you were actually in a class of mine. So yeah, I got to witness, or we kind of obviously kind of simultaneously experienced the shutdown of class in Western together. But then, you know, how did that impact your art making? And then in some ways, you know, it really, really influenced the kind of work you made during your BFA year. Love to hear, yeah, about your experience.
So I think it was February. I had my first solo show in the B Gallery at Western. I was very excited, and I wrote something in my artist statement about how I had this like kind of very wonderful body of work about like my body and my own experiences, and that after this show I wanted to move away from that. And so right around when the pandemic hit, I was experimenting more. I was kind of trying to find like a new sort of mode of making. And I'm very lucky that my show happened right before everything shut down, that I was able to kind of celebrate with my friends. And so I remember getting excited for all these like shows that were coming up and all these receptions that were going to happen. And everything kind of stopped. And I ended up going back to Utah for what I thought was going to be 2 weeks for spring break, to my hometown. And I was there for 4 or 5 months. And so it was really a kind of full 180, and I had to kind of start over and figure out what I wanted to do, what was inspiring me. And yeah, it was very interesting to kind of have to adapt all of a sudden. I taught myself how to use Photoshop and kind of the Adobe suite. Since there wasn't a lot of art supplies I brought with me, I was like, well, I've got my computer. Let's see what we can do with this. And so throughout of like a lot of really kind of horrible situations, a lot of stressful situations, I was able to learn more about Photoshop and graphic design. And I've had a couple opportunities to make more graphic work. I also ended up applying to the BFA online from Utah. And so it's very interesting kind of to see how this year's gone compared to last year. Last year's cohort with Shannon did a lot of work so that we were able to access our studios and that we were able to have the show that we currently have in the Western Gallery. So it's been quite a bureaucratic nightmare. But yeah, I'm also really grateful to all of the staff members that really kind of fought for us to be able to use these spaces, and we've been getting tested every other week. Yeah, it's definitely changed the way I make art. This whole piece is about the pandemic, and I've definitely seen a lot of art shift into more of this focus on home in personal spaces and personal feelings. And so I think thematically that's been a very fascinating shift.
Thanks, Nicole. This next question, actually, I'm going to boomerang, like reversed direction, because it speaks to your work in a lot of ways, Nicole. It's about isolation and how we've had to adapt to this isolation over the past few, 14 months. Is it 15 now? I don't know. So The question is, how have you navigated the isolation within your field? You know, as artists, we depend heavily on community for opportunities, for support. And yeah, how has this isolation, how have you navigated that isolation within your art practice, within your professional practice?
I am really grateful that I had my BFA cohort to kind of be my community. We have a Discord server that we all kind of chat on. And so that for most of the time has been my community. I've definitely tried to reach out more to other artists on Instagram and kind of make those connections digitally, which is always kind of hard. The one thing about the isolation that's been nice is being able to really like intensely focus on making art. It's been kind of hard to be creative in that isolation because when you're around people, you can, you know, come up with ideas and kind of work more conceptually on your art. And so this year I chose to stick to kind of very solid ideas and then spent a lot of more time on the craft part in the process of making things because that was something that was very meditative and that helped me through kind of these feelings of isolation and loneliness. This entire costume is hand woven, and so I would sit, you know, alone in my room on Zoom classes, just constantly pulling yarn and weaving, and I think that really helped get me through it, just to have something to do when there wasn't anything else we were supposed to be doing.
And a follow-up, because that work is so much in conversation with isolation, did that send you further into isolation, or did it connect you and have like a talking point that connected you to other artists?
It became a talking point and a connection point for other people. I was wearing this costume out and about, and that kind of created a little bit of a disturbance in the neighborhood, and a way for me to be able to connect with people from a distance. And it kind of, you know, it gave me a friend throughout quarantine. And so I felt a little bit less lonely knowing I had this weird cryptid hanging out with me. Yeah.
What about you, Shannon? How have you navigated the isolation brought on by the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for me because my entire BFA series was kind of about isolation and depression and anxiety and like being in a state of mind with yourself that's difficult. Like I created these paintings that were kind of windows into memories of being isolated and being alone and being more sad. And so I don't know, it's funny because yeah, by the end of the BFA series, I was like, I got to get out of these windows. But yeah, I think just like being so immersed in that and just having to face it for me was like a really cathartic experience. Just painting all of those, and I feel like it's a good sign. I want to get out of the windows by the end of it because I'm just feeling good, and so yeah, I feel like while the pandemic has been really isolating and difficult, especially as an artist and just as a human, I feel like it's brought us closer to things that bring us joy or like move us forward, because it's given us so much time to think about what we really want or what moves us. So yeah, I'm trying to focus on that and yeah, like find what makes me passionate. I don't know. I feel like it's difficult when we are isolated and we're so much in like the digital world. And like, I know for me, that's hard because I feel like social media, even though it can be a great tool for artists in so many ways, and like we've seen so many incredible examples of that, like I feel like for me, it's kind of a creative suck, like a just an energy suck. So I'd be interested to hear what other people's relationships are
To social media in terms of that promising connection, but actually delivering further isolation. Yes.
yeah
Quentin, if you want to talk about isolation and also engage, or if you want to engage with what Shannon brought up in terms of connecting digitally with community, if you have any experience with that.
I mean, I think we're all sort of like, at this point, like we're all digital natives in some respect, right? Like be undialectical to sort of like imagine that we haven't been like irreparably like touched by the nature of social media in some sort of way. And like, I think for me at least, like the physical isolation was like not super bad because I have roommates. And so it's like living with people makes it a little bit easier that I like love and we all care for each other. And especially at the beginning, we're like eating family dinners and like going on walks when like things were sort of like much more closed down. And so I think having that base was like very helpful to me. But I mean, the image that I showed for my intro slide was a piece that I recently worked on. We've been like my roommates and I have been watching the series of like we've been calling it like the Technophobia series of movies. And one of the movies that I watched recently was Videodrome by my boy, and he's like Cronenberg, and Cronenberg's sort of thesis in that is that like what happens is that like the screen is so powerful that it's sort of like his main character just does whatever the last person on a screen told him to do. And the tagline there is like long live the new flesh, that this sort of like that we're like constantly being dominated by technology in such a way that it's like changing the nature of our interpersonal relationships. And so I think that like being forced into the digital world as like the only way of connectivity has like reaffirmed like the opposite for me about how much more I don't want to use the negative word, but it's like how much more sort of like mystifying the nature of online is in putting us into sort of self-delusional, self-hypnotic states. Whereas the actual like friction of like contact with people is the like, it's like difference is the way that we can tell things are real in a way, because all of a sudden it becomes something that's outside of myself, and online is a reflective medium. And so a lot of my work recently has been dealing with like the sort of anxieties about like being watched and what being like self-conscious senses of like observation change like the nature of our own sort of like self-mythology. What happens when we know we're constantly being watched? And not like that, we're doing it now. And so I think that I would encourage people to log off or find the thing that is like the social media in your world and get away from it, that creative suck that is reflective. That'll reduce your isolation.
I agree. I did that a lot over the pandemic. I disengaged with social media for my mental health, but it sounds like, you know, you do what, or a lot of people are doing what artists do, and that like you're using your work to process this. So you're using this highly digital moment or way we're forced to interact digitally to serve your work. And as an aside, I want to add to your list of technophobic or movies about technophobia. I just watched You've Got Mail last night with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, and it's about finding love over AOL Messenger, and it's awful. It's a total gross catfishing situation, and it's so dystopic. It's disgusting, but maybe it's good for research.
Absolutely.
All right. Jokes aside, Debbie, you are in the densest metropolis in the country, and you know, what was this isolation like for you, being amidst so many people?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I mean, going off of what Quentin said, it's a very hard time to not be good at computers. Um, but it's interesting. Like during the time, I feel like the first month, everyone was calling me. They were like, "What's New York like?" Just like so curious. And from the inside, it was kind of my personal experience was kind of like a fishbowl almost, because I moved, my studio home, and I happened to live on the first floor of an apartment building in Brooklyn, in a pretty busy neighborhood, and my room actually faces the street, and so people walk by, and I live one block from a hospital, a very big hospital, and so there was a lot of sirens going by, and just kind of staring out the window and being, in bed and hearing someone like profusely coughing out the window and being like, oh my gosh, can this go through a window? And so it was an interesting form of isolation to be so in such a big place and to be able to hear your neighbors through the walls, but then to be not engaging with what New York is all about, which is people and culture and going outside. But yeah, as far as the question goes, I think I tried to embrace the isolation a bit, instead of just finding ways to work around it, which I'll get to in a minute. But I think for me, like I'm a pretty hard worker. I go pretty hard, and so I tried to really give myself a break and to just be okay with slowing down and processing, the loss that was going on all around us. And I ended up kind of finding my own ways to make deadlines for things and finding my own ways to be creative in a space that was like that. My partner actually ended up getting COVID in 2021, and he's totally all okay. I'm very grateful for. But the experience resulted in me ending up in the New York City COVID hotel program for a week, which means you're basically isolated in a room, and they bring you 3 meals a day, and it's all free from the state, which is wonderful. But you're just totally isolated in there. And I actually had a show coming up. This was like 3 months ago, and I hadn't finished the work yet, and so I had 2 paintings in there with me, and I was just painting during this whole experience. And it was kind of the maybe the pinnacle of the bizarreness of the whole thing, to be in New York City, in Times Square, in a hotel, looking out my window, another kind of fishbowl, watching people go by as it was starting to open up again, and to be maybe the most scared I had been so far of the whole experience. But during that time, I had my art and I was working on it, and I had a deadline, and I had things to keep me moving forward and processing. But yeah, before that happened, I think, going back to the digital thing, so in 2018, I started a women's painting group, and it was mostly in person, but we switched to doing stuff digitally and just connecting with some of them in particular, and texting images of our work. And talking about if we weren't working, that's okay, consoling each other. And then also Instagram, I think it was around the beginning of the pandemic, they launched the Instagram Live feature, which was huge for me, because when I was in my little fishbowl, I was also like looking outward and getting to see people's studios from a safe distance. And people were really open to that, which maybe certain curators wouldn't have interacted with other curators or artists, and it really brought a lot of people together because there was no limits of space or even time zones. So it was really cool. I think that's how I dealt with it all.
Yeah, I remember there was such a big boom when the Instagram Live was so perfectly timed. And I want to add, so much culture became accessible in terms of events online from museums and galleries, studios all over the country. That felt so helpful early on to me too. And then I have to admit, the last thing I wanted to do was attend any Zoom thing. So thank you, the 34 participants who are here. Yeah. Have you been keeping up on like the kind of cultural community participation online these days? Like
Still?
Yeah, going to events like art events.
Yeah, it's opening up a lot more. It's different than it was You know, like I still forget a lot of times I have to make an appointment to go to a gallery, and I show up and they're like, oh, you know, we didn't have anyone come in because there was no appointments. And I'm like, I forgot about that whole thing. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff opening up, and it's been exciting now that it's warmer too. You can kind of like spill outside and maybe have a drink with your mask off. And you know, now that everyone's getting vaccinated, it's really changed. I think I've started to see like music events popping up and other things, and the warm weather is really helping with that. So it's definitely feeling like it was maybe in like the spring when we were hesitant still, but with a lot more like knowledge and skills for how to navigate things.
Thank you. Sheldon, how have you navigated the isolation of the pandemic?
From a work standpoint, it's been pretty difficult, especially early on. Like Debbie was saying, I love to work. I love what I do. And I go pretty hard at it normally. And so, you know, on a typical project, you know, there's anywhere from 4 to 50 people. And so not being able to be around friends and colleagues and clients was really difficult. I feel a lot of responsibility for assistants and techs and some of the folks in the industry that I get to work with, in that I'm fortunate enough to have, you know, had a level of success and have a savings, and I was able to weather things fairly easily. However, all the people that I normally hire and pay on projects, they had a harder time. And so I spent the earliest days of the pandemic trying to figure out ways that I could help, you know, the people that were closest to me and who helped me throughout the year. And so, you know, I'd randomly find projects around the studio that had nothing to do with jobs, but it allowed them to come in and make some money and have, you know, a level of normalcy in their lives as well. Things have definitely gotten better in the last couple months as vaccines have been rolling out. Last week, I did my first travel job in 13 months, went to San Diego for a week. And so, you know, we had a crew of 50. And so that was a very weird, it felt strange to be around so many people again for about 15 minutes. And then everybody kind of falls into their role and everybody remembers, you know, why you're there and why you're doing this thing that you love. And it's a little different in that, you know, you're wearing masks and you're trying to stay apart from each other whenever you can. But it was great to feel and see the energy of everybody to get back into doing what they love.
That's a relief. I can feel I can feel it lifting slowly. But my next question relates to the lasting impact of the pandemic on our various areas of the art world. I know things are starting to come back, but for a lot of us, they're coming back so differently. Like Debbie mentioned, you know, the whole gallery appointment system, but that's just one example. So I'm curious, I'll start with you, Quentin, just to mix it up. Like, what do you think are the lasting impacts of the pandemic on the art world part of the art world that you inhabit?
I feel like one of the biggest issues we're seeing is that like there's been this massive drop in just wealth of people. All these venues closing down, galleries closing down. And there is some that are able to like move or like weather the storm and things, and like it's not that there won't be more like, or that at some point like house shows, like smaller venues, like DIY spaces won't recover in some way. But I do think that it is like another example of how like we're seeing like the slow privatization of like the art world is very real, and the forcing into like modes of self-commodification in the spectacle is like only heightened and intensified by the nature of self-isolation and of the like desperateness of artists, the squeezing of spaces into smaller and smaller junctures until like, and I think that those sorts of things are going to have like serious impact, as well as just like the psychic sort of like trauma, and the nature of that like probably won't manifest for a moment, but it's like I think about one of the museums here in Philadelphia. It's called like Please Touch Museum. Not anymore, and it's like those types of things where we're going to have like a hesitancy or anxiety around like natures of like health, bodily interaction, interpersonal like action, like those sorts of things that are going to be compounded by the reduction of people's availability to express themselves outside of like private institution, which is like a dictatorial form in and of itself.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're talking about like the consolidation of power in some ways. Like there's less there may be fewer options for people with less resources because of the struggle of being an artist. And then so the reliance on these larger institutions are becoming more, or yeah, we're relying more heavily on them to do
like
the cultural work.
Like being in a graduate program was really nice because being in an institution was safe until eventually I wasn't, and then had to go to work. And so you, no more art, just being out in the pandemic at the beginning months. Like, and I think that that's going to be a real thing.
Debbie, I'll bounce back to you just because I already referenced one of your points, but yeah, what do you see as like a lasting impact in the art world?
Let's see.
Or many
Well,
less.
yeah. So I think for, certain skills also that I'm going to take forward from there are like maybe just being like more courageous. Just because like when you're stuck behind a wall of some kind and you're trying to reach out to people, it's like I never would think of like adding somebody or like messaging somebody on Instagram that was like, kind of out of my like art field world. And now I feel like I have no shame or shyness because it was like a year and a half or whatever of just like that was how you connected with people. And same thing for like, applying to things. Like I feel like most of us that apply to things a lot, we kind of know the realm of stuff we're likely to considered for and stuff that would be a long shot. And just being like, you know what, aim for it, like figure it out, try it, because there's not much to lose. And I don't know. So I feel like I've gained a little bit of courage. Even now I see it in myself, like going into galleries and like socializing again and being like, hey, I talked to you on Instagram all winter. And it's versus like before, maybe I was a little more timid with strangers. And I think that just goes into like the lasting impact. I feel like people are kind of like, they're really open to socializing. Like at the opening I had a couple months ago, it was a mixture of like New York City people and people in Tarrytown, which is about an hour north of the heart of the city. And it was so cool to see all the different experiences and people talking outside and just like, this is so cool, there's live music. And but yeah, other things I think are like, just financial strategies and figuring out like, especially while being on unemployment, like what do I really need for my practice? And there's something in grad school we talked about a lot, was the idea of what if you were making art on an island, without all this pressure of grad school and, the world around you and Instagram and such, like what would you actually be making if you just had palm trees and like dirt and stuff, sand. And so I started thinking more in that way and like making more studies of things and working smaller. And I've carried that forward now into my practice where I am, getting income again. But I've realized, like I don't need certain things, or I don't need to make a giant painting without having really thought about it and made smaller studies. So those are resources I would say. And maybe just a general like tenacity and just like toughness of like, you know, going through something that everybody else also went through. It's very like, yeah, I think I feel a little bit more like, okay, what's next? Like, especially in New York where, you know, just like getting a slice of pizza or something can be an experience. And so I feel like I've got more of some more like wind in my sails, I guess is what I would say, which is funny because it was and is a very sad time. And so it's a strange thing to say that, but I do feel that way.
Yeah, there's a lot of sadness and grief, but then also like growth and gratitude that I hear expressed from a lot of people coming out of this. Thanks for that, Debbie. Sheldon, how about, I'm gonna direct the question back to you. How do you feel like the pandemic is gonna irreversibly impact your field?
I think I do a lot of work in advertising, and so you know, it at the heart of it, it might be as far away from artistic practice as possible. However, it's full of people who love what they do, and they love creating, and they love collaborating, and they love it so much that they never stop doing it when you're working. And I think one thing that my colleagues and I are going to take out of the pandemic is you do need to stop and take time for yourself and your family and your friends. And you know that there'll always be another day to create something or to work on a project. And I alluded earlier, I talked about 2019 was it was my busiest year of my career. And the pandemic allowed me to have the time to step back, forced me to have the time to step back and realize like, wow, I really was working way more than I want to be or need to be, even though it's what I love to do. There's still a healthy balance there that I think will carry on once the pandemic's over. People taking that time for themselves, even if it's doing the same thing, you know, even if I were to go and work on a personal photo project, it's not my money-making side of what I do. And so that alone allows that separation.
Yeah, it sounds like you got to reflect on your priorities as a creative person, even though you work in a commercial field. You're a, you know, you just, it's wonderful when everyone gets opportunities, but how do you want to balance that out with, you know, what you love about being an artist, being a creative person?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. Shannon, how about for you? Impacts of the pandemic on your various, I know, you know, I imagine like for Quentin, the world looks so different than you imagined leaving Western.
Yeah, totally. I definitely relate to Quentin, and just like I expected to leave my program and just like apply for a bunch of things and just like be hopeful for different opportunities. And that's definitely had to shift. And I feel like for me, like my artistic practice is very personal and like it comes from within. And I feel like it is strange to be faced with like the insertion of like capitalism within my practice. Like I feel like all of my friends are, and like I know that they mean it well, but they're just like, you know, like start an Instagram business, like just like hustle on Etsy. And like there's no shame in that, obviously. Like it's like those are incredible fields and like people are really happy doing that, but I feel like pulled in different directions based on what I want to do. And like the idea of commodifying my art, like I know that's something we all face, and I don't know, it just makes you question what is like the value of your own work, like what is fine art now. And so yeah, I think it's been really impactful for just like my path and where I've chosen to go. Like I think I like balance those two things. Like even though like I did my entire series painting, like I have done more digital work and like had to get creative, just like a lot of you. So yeah, it's a roller coaster.
That it is. And Nicole, you are just emerging, so I'm curious to hear what you have to say about a lasting impact, positive or negative, about you know.
One of the positives I've seen is art, and especially like film and TV, got a lot of people through this pandemic and got a lot of people through isolation. I've watched more TV than I've ever watched in my lifetime this year. I've watched more movies. I mean, this piece is titled after Doctor Strangelove and how I learned to stop worrying about the atomic bomb. It's the Yeti Squatch and how I learned to stop worrying about the pandemic. And so I think in the future, people's appreciation for art has gone up, and I think that'll stay around. People are kind of looking at the things that they were doing and they're like, okay, I really like art. Art is really important to me. So I think in the future, there's going to be a bigger interest in it. And I also think in terms of like gallery shows, museums, I think we're going to see a lasting digital side of galleries and of museums. The entire Louvre collection is now online. And so I think in terms of that sort of accessibility digital wise, we're going to see a lot more of that. We're going to see a lot more digital artist talks like this. I think that's something that's here to stay in terms of making art more accessible online. I know a lot of galleries and museums are like, oh no, we got to get like an Instagram right now. And so I think you're going to see a lot more digital art. I think that's going to be the largest transfer. And I think you're also going to see a lot less art. I've been slowing down my practice and I've been focusing on like big projects. And I think a lot of people, you know, who are making these like really big bodies of works, kind of when everything stopped, they stopped and they're like, okay, well, let me prioritize the things that are important to me. Is this what I really want to be making? And so I think that was something that I was really fortunate to be able to do, is to step back and be like, okay, where do I want my practice to go? And so I think we're going to see slower art.
Thanks, Nicole. I think this actually relates to another question in terms of resources that have been helpful in the past year that we were not previously utilizing. And that speaks to the fact that so many collections have been digitized. There's so many art events online that are more accessible, whether or not you want to attend them due to Zoom fatigue. But yeah, what resources have you all been utilizing that you weren't previously before the pandemic? And I'll jump to you, Debbie, because you're unmuted. Why not?
Awesome. Well, so I think I was talking about this a bit already, but obviously the digital things and like being able to show up in a gallery and be more confident. And I think just like realizing you're not alone, which sounds, that's not really a resource, I guess, but more just something I'm taking with it. But I also wanted to add on to, this kind of ties into the last question about the impact, which is that, I think maybe overall, like we're all kind of realizing, what essential workers are in the art world. And so like, for instance, like one of the jobs that I've done between major, like managing jobs has been freelancing art handling. And that's been a great thing for me in New York City. And that is probably the most essential worker when it comes to galleries, because, if they're not there, then the show doesn't get installed. And so, during a time when a lot of people were able to get on unemployment, a lot of galleries have struggled getting people back into their galleries when they realize, they're making a pretty good wage now. And so I think maybe we're all kind of learning what, like, the problematic ways we talk about value, and how we can do better going forward, and how to make work environments good for people. And which I think is, something that resourcefully I've brought to my employers now as I go forward, being more confident, asking for things, prioritizing my own practice and realizing that time I had to really reflect and kind of like some of the other panelists were saying, but like being able to go slower and maybe realizing I might not have needed to be working as hard, and that there's oftentimes the quality over quantity thing is really important. And art making can't happen in, there's no hour equivalent in the same way there is with a job. But yeah.
Just for those of some people in the audience and myself included, could you describe the job duties of an art handler?
Art handler, of course. Well, it's a very male-dominated field. I will just start with that, but it's a really interesting job. So if you've ever been to a museum and you see like, works on the wall and you're like, man, they really got these all centered with each other. That's crazy. How'd that happen? That's because somebody does that for a living, and they use tools to make that happen. But it's a really like a crazy job that changes a lot. So if you're working in a museum, maybe you'd be doing like multiple floors of installation, and sometimes you're putting like, an Ai Weiwei piece with all these tiny little like elements of something, making sure it's all put together and stacked. Or sometimes you're doing a normal painting on a wall, or you're helping with a performance piece, and the lighting that goes into that and the filming of it. So it's kind of like a behind the scenes, like if you've ever, seen the theater world, the people who make the furniture and make sure things like the set changes happen. But it's a crucial part of the art world. And because it's not, we don't think of those people as making the art or something, like a lot of times they get overlooked and it can be a high turnover job. But as, being an emerging artist in the biggest art city in the country, like that is a survival job for most emerging artists. They have done some kind of work like that where they've helped an artist or they've helped at a gallery. And so without them and having, being there to help, and also on the flip side, without them having access to that work, the art world really wouldn't be what it is today. And a lot of those art handlers go on to show at some of those galleries. So it's an interesting and really important, but often unseen part of the art world.
Yeah, and to speak to it being a male-dominated field, there's a person, Jess Gettler at the Henry Art Gallery, who started a kind of collective to like mentor young female or femme identifying people who want to get into prepared or art handling work. I thought that was pretty great.
Wonderful.
Yeah, Jess Gettler is her name.
If they want to bring it over here, it'd be great.
Yeah, and I'm glad you opened it up, because we're talking about the resources that we've been utilizing, but you kind of opened it up to like, kind of human resources and tools. So I will send this question back over to you, Sheldon. Are there tools or resources that you are utilizing now that you can see carrying through after lockdown, post-pandemic?
Yeah, definitely on the technology side. I think I'm going to be doing a lot more remote art direction, letting clients be in their offices or wherever they are, and being able to have a live view of what's going on, a real-time view of what's coming through the cameras. So from a work technology standpoint, that's definitely here to stay, which is tough because it's quite an investment, on this side of it to make that happen. On the personal side, I bought more art books and prints from colleagues and friends and strangers in the last year than I've bought in the previous 10. And so, I primarily used my Instagram account to find people whose work was amazing, and then proceeded to find out if they had books or prints for sale, to get a physical, tangible thing from those artists that I can enjoy, for the rest of my life. And so, and hopefully, it helped them out as well. So for me, it's a little bit of like a step back to the analog world and step away from the digital side, at least on the personal side of my life. And it's even extended to which side am I? So I'm doing big 11:17 view camera portrait project here in the studio, and that's something I would not have done 15 months ago. It's cumbersome, but it takes me back to how I learned. There was no digital component to the photography program at Western when I was there, and so the technology pieces will definitely carry through, but I think the simplification of in kind of like a distillation down of what is the art part of it for somebody like me who's been working for 2 decades in making a living at doing this, getting back to those things on a pure, more personal level, and less on the work side.
Yeah, you said a lot of great things. I've also heard a lot of media makers doing remote directing, like moving image media directors in like Hollywood. That seems to be a new thing, but I like what you said. You're investing in technology, but also investing in analog technology, going back to basics, or back to basics, because it's
You're right.
Yeah. Basics in a really, really highly advanced way. That's wonderful. And sounds like I hear from a lot of people are really reconnecting with their practice and re-evaluating certain aspects of it in really important ways. I'll send this question over to you, Shannon. What resources are you utilizing now that you can see moving forward?
I think for me, I've just been reading a lot, fiction, nonfiction, just like art, coffee table books, magazines. I feel like just immersing myself in a lot of different worlds and stories has been really helpful, just with like feeling like a lack of creativity or motivation in my own world. It's nice to view somebody else's. So that's been really inspiring and something I want to continue to make time for moving forward. Yeah.
Thanks, Shannon. How about you, Quentin, and then Nicole?
Yeah, I've also gone back to shooting film again. I recently got a little old Olympus point and shoot that I am in love with, and started off the pandemic by just shooting like a roll of film every like 2 or 3 days, just to try and like make sure that I would remember that it was real. And only recently started doing it again, but also reading a lot has been a thing. I finally read all or almost all of Capital, Volume 1, because I got to give a shout out. And it was a very different experience than like I think reading in school, where you're being exposed to so many different ideas, some like all over the place, but they're all little snippets or like sort of what you hope can be the best overview in some sort of way. And to have the ability to spend time like on like 1,000 pages of just like one sort of like vision has it was incredibly enlightening for me, because I think I mean, this isn't Marx, but my boy Walter Benjamin talks about how the revolutionary is essentially the person that pulls the emergency brake, because the speed of progress is always like moving us forward, and so history can't actually take care of us, or we can't take care of like building history. And learning that, like, I loved Nicole's point about slowing down and like immersing myself in like physical media, but also in like trying to like slowly but surely work through this like one idea has been it's something that I would like to carry forward in my practice is that sort of consideration.
Yeah, that taking the time to like deep dive into creative or theoretical research for your practice. I love that. And impressed that you were able to focus that much. I have had a very hard time with that. Nicole, how about you?
I think one of the most important things that I've utilized is just the like mass amount of information there is online. I've been really trying to think about my work in the context of kind of the greater art world as I'm looking towards graduation. And so reading about other artists like Rachel White Reed, who are doing works about the house and about home, has been really inspiring. And I've also been able to do a lot of research and hear a lot of like personal accounts and people talking about cryptids a lot. There's a lot of essays about the culture of all these kind of like mythological creatures we have. And I've read some phenomenal essays that I don't know if I would have been able to find if I hadn't gone on these kind of deep dives into like the trenches of Google. I've been able to connect with a lot of people all across like the United States, talking about like art and homes. And so I think it's definitely something that I'm really lucky to be able to have access to. And with the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people were putting things out online for free. And so all of a sudden, all of these like scholarly articles and all of these books were downloadable as PDFs. And so I have a whole folder on my laptop full of books about, you know, thinking about art history and thinking about, you know, the origins of a lot of these mythical figures. And so that's been a lot of fun for me to read through. And I've also been watching a lot of documentaries about art making and about kind of like the origins of installation art as we see it today. And that's been like one of my biggest inspirations. Mm-hmm.
I hope that accessibility continues forever. Yeah.
It's definitely very inspiring to have that access, especially as like a college student who may not have the resources for some of this stuff in a typical year. I've been able to do a lot.
Yeah, and as a college student, you have a lot of access to libraries that gives you access to journal articles, but it's so important to have that access beyond being a student.
Exactly.
I'm going to give you all a question from the audience, which is kind of returning and reflecting on your BFA time. The question is, you've all been sharing about your current bodies of work. Thinking back to your BFA show, how has your work evolved from then? What were you creating then compared to what you're creating now? And I'm going to go furthest back to most recent. So Sheldon, do you remember 2003 and what you were creating and how it's changed?
Yeah, that's back there. So I did pretty much my whole undergraduate and BFA thesis in self-portraiture. So I pretty much spent the years running around naked and around all kinds of places around Bellingham and taking self-portraits. It is pretty different than what I currently do. And you know, the other day I actually was thinking about back to something that Garth Amundsen and I spoke about when I was finishing school was, you know, he brought up the idea of, you know, revisiting that type of work, you know, 20 years later, right? You know, I'm no longer 25 years old. And so what does that process look like, you know, in my 40s versus in my 20s? And I don't know that I'm there to recreate any of those specific images, but I'm really grateful for that time that I spent doing that. It was extremely introspective, and I have a hard time personally calling myself and relating to myself as an artist. I don't really consider myself an artist. I consider myself a technician more than anything. But my time spent in the BFA program, I think allowed me to think a little more in that direction, and be okay, you know, with considering myself an artist and doing things, you know, more from a primal or emotional, introspective place than you know, the world that I live in now.
And did you call yourself an artist back then?
I don't think so. I think I would have called myself a photographer. And I mean, that's what I would call myself now. Other people would, you know, classify me differently. But you know, I wouldn't consider I don't call myself an artist, but I do consider myself creative and collaborative, which, you know, go hand in hand with art and creating art. And a lot of the processes are the same. It's, you know, it's just a title, right? It's just, it's all semantics. It's if I want to call myself a photographer, I'm a photographer. If I want to call myself an artist, I'm an artist. That's in here. That's nobody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the title artist is so loaded, and I know a lot of people don't feel comfortable taking that on. I know it took a long time for me to even feel connected to that, and then I actually did for some reason. But yeah, we all should be able to self-identify as we wish. I'm glad you brought that up, Sheldon. And yeah, for you, Debbie, that same question. I can just reiterate it. Just like what? Yeah. How has your work evolved from when you were a BFA? What were you creating then compared to now?
Yeah, I think it's been a few years. I graduated 2014, but I remember it well. I was making installation art. I got my like BA in painting and then the BFA in installation. Yeah, and I was making, it was when like the B gallery had really started to take off, and I was helping run it with another student, and Pierre Guire. And yeah, so I did a lot of installations in there. I covered like the whole ceiling and did a collaborative installation with another student at the time, Hannah Swick. So the whole ceiling was like this black paper kind of swirly thing. So it was a lot of like, really like abstracted, but like had some kind of weight emotionally to the work, and a lot of large scale things. I did like a weird, I think it's called the Annex Gallery or something on the second floor of the Art to Permit. I don't know if it's still there, but I took over that space and made there was 2 doors. So I made like a tunnel that you go through one door and come out the other.
Was that on the 3rd floor? No.
Yeah, second floor, I think.
Second, okay.
Yeah, but it's probably something totally different now. It was kind of like above the office area. But yeah, and so after I graduated, I went and got a degree in sculpture. So I switched, I kind of pursued that direction from painting to installation to sculpture. And then of course I graduated and started, working my way back to painting. And so now I make paintings, but I do, the painting that was showed in the slide is actually 5 interlocking linen canvases that are put together. And I make all those myself, and I think a lot about space. And so even though I have a degree in painting, sculpture, and installation, and now I paint, I think I bring all 3 of those to the table with my paintings. And when I got to grad school, I was really interested in like, what would it be like if I made a 3D painting that you were in? And so I spent like the first year of grad school just making these weird installations that were kind of like paintings you could walk into. And I think I still like fantasize about that a bit when I make paintings, like, especially if I have the chance to make something bigger than the body. I think a lot about architecture and how we kind of push back against the history of what painting is, but without like totally going out the door of it. And so I think a lot about that, and working with shaped canvases is also very sculptural, and I think makes you think about your body in relation to them as well. And conceptually, I would say, Western from when I was there, it was a very conceptual time. I'm not sure if it necessarily the school or the time, but I really enjoyed that beginning. But I think the more I've advanced, I've kind of like let the concept sort of maybe bloom and kind of open up and breathe a little more. And so I have, I always have concepts I make in my work, but I don't necessarily like try to force them in or really like, I don't know, they kind of just like almost, I think about them after when I'm titling the work and realizing like maybe I was going through the experience of the pandemic, or maybe like, the uprising this summer or whatnot. Like there's a lot of things that that come into the work that I don't really know until after.
Thanks, Debbie. Quentin, and you were just a year after Debbie.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I remember your work, but yeah.
I was going to say it's been a moment since I've talked about it, but I feel like all of my work is doing the same thing. I feel like I'm just constantly remaking the same piece over and over again, but I just don't realize it until it's like long after, because like I'm very fascinated by the same sort of issues still, though I have like very different takes because when I was making my BFA work, it was all based around sort of thinking about this idea of like how do we take the internet as being real in some way, and or like is there sort of like digital materiality in like the world that we like pour all this stuff into like becomes its own thing that is like it presents itself to us in a way that we understand it, but actually there's like a whole thing going on behind the scenes that none of us have any idea or understanding about. And now like I have much better sort of understanding of what that is, like the algorithm and all these other things. And so I feel like my work has sort of like lost a level of like, I don't know, naive optimism about digital technologies, and much more sort of like, not down on them, but I think much more complicated relationship, or like trying to constantly like make that relationship more complex, and let it breathe rather than like understand it in the moment in the way that Debbie was talking about. But I think that that's just the thing that comes with age as well. Like you learn to trust yourself as an artist, and let it sort of like happen. Because I do think that like also it's like in my quest to understand it, I was forcing it to be something that it maybe like then only like a year after I'm like, this is so wrong. It was actually about this. But we're always the last person to know something about ourselves.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes that long to really understand what work is about sometimes.
Yeah.
Or we would talk about it so differently
10
years and maybe more clearly years after its creation.
Yeah.
Shannon, how about you? And you're so recent, and then Nicole,
Yeah. So yeah, my series was influenced by a couple different things. It was kind of based on like a period of time in my past where I was experiencing mental hardship. And then in the third quarter of my BFA, I took Paul Bernhardt's experimental painting class, and the whole thing was like create a model and then like paint solely from the model the whole time. And so I took that hard experience, which like took place in like my bedroom, like in my bed, and I like rebuilt it in the model. And then I just took photos of that, and that became my series. Like I painted. So it was kind of like this weird disconnect between like memory and time and recreating like a traumatic experience to explore it. And yeah, so at this point, it's funny, I like just went home. I'm from California, and I went home and visited my family for the first time in like a year and a half, which was really nice. But my mom, they're like in the process of moving, and she saved all of my old toys, like my like Polly Pockets and like just like all little items that have like a lot of significance or did. Like I was looking through them and remembering playing with them when I was a kid. and it's really inspired me, and kind of, I don't know, I feel like I've had like a lot of creative thoughts in the past few days. So that's kind of exciting. And it kind of connects to like working from like a small model, like recreating something that once was in a different way. So yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring that.
Thank you. Yeah, your experience is so recent. And Nicole, maybe I'm just going to give you, I'm going to start the new question because you're not out of school yet. So, but maybe, I mean, briefly, you could talk about your BFA year, and then I'll move up to the last question.
I apologize in advance if you can hear the background noise that kind of just started. Before this, I had been making a lot of work about like my body, my experiences in my body. And so then after I was like, okay, I'm going to move away from that. And then I started building the Yeti Squatch costume. And I realized just in like talking about my art and talking about where I was going with it, I had come back to this idea of like talking about my body and my experiences in my body. And part of the Yeti Squatch piece is me not knowing if I could trust my body to keep me safe because of just the pandemic and kind of this invisible threat. And also with some other experiences that had happened before the pandemic where I was like, I don't know if I can trust my body. I'm nervous all the time. Can I trust, that gut reaction? And so having like a different body that I could go be was a really interesting escape for me. And so I think that's what I was exploring in my BFA year, which had changed a little bit from beforehand, where I was more exploring past experiences instead of kind of looking towards the future or the present.
Thank you. So last question. So it's a brief one because we have to wrap up at 1:30 in respect of everyone's time. So about 30 seconds each, I want you all to like give us your last word on the topic, in terms of wisdom you can share based on what you've learned from this experience, for our audience who are largely students and artists themselves. And I'm going to go back to the top, same order as last time. Sheldon, your last word and piece of wisdom that you'd like to leave our audience with.
I think for me, the biggest thing that everybody should really take to heart coming out of this pandemic, hopefully coming out of this pandemic, is to not focus or put a lot of your energy into one place, and don't tightly define what it is you're trying to do or trying to accomplish. I think there's plenty of opportunity that is going to come up in all aspects. There's a lot of empty buildings, at least here in Portland, in the downtown area. Everything's empty. There's spaces. There are people who love art and want to see artists survive and thrive, and forming groups of people who can go after those spaces and fill them with art to bring people back into those downtown areas, I think would be a really, really great thing.
Awesome. Thank you, Sheldon. Debbie.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think kind of a two-part answer. The first being like, don't be afraid to, try something new, or to just like, I don't know, to maybe examine who you are and what you're doing and what path that you're on. Kind of like what Sheldon was saying, like branching out a bit, maybe not putting your effort into one thing, but also like, I don't know, maybe just like focusing on like the quality of life and the thing that you're doing, and all the things that we've talked about so far. And then also, we didn't talk too much about the whole, political times we're in as well, but also maybe thinking about how that interacts with that. And like, the way that I've been thinking about that is just examining, what situations am I in, and is it my turn to be talking or my turn to be listening? Because a lot of times, most of us here are probably pretty initiative takers. And sometimes, you can do harm by just taking initiative, and it's time, which is a good thing usually. But I think this has been a time where people could really stop and think a little bit more and assess. So I guess that overall, it's just like thinking and assessing and before you take a step.
Yeah, reflecting and being more intentional about how one can be of service.
Intentional.
Yeah, thank you. Quentin.
I also have a little bit of a two-parter, but I think they're connected. That first, art is about having fun with your friends. Art can do lots of things, but ultimately, it's about sharing that sort of trans individuality between the hope that we can all find some sort of emotional connection together. And so you have to have a healthy relationship with the people that you love with it. And then two, learn to let go, because I think one of the things that's happened over the pandemic is that everybody has driven themselves completely neurotic and insane. And it's by constantly focusing on things that we can't actually touch in any way. And so focusing on your life and in such a way that you're able to directly and positively make connection and change to it is going to get you far closer to alleviating your anxiety, to making good art, having better practice, than to be sort of out there constantly nervous about whatever it is.
Right, we have control over so little. Is what I've learned over the past year. Shannon.
Yeah, I think for me, I would say manage your expectations or try to have no expectations. I also have found, my friends and I talk a lot about how the only thing that's real is the present moment right now. And in that sense, maybe nothing's real because you can never quite be in the present. But yeah, I just think being in the present, managing your expectations, doing your best, and yeah, just being nice to yourself.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Shannon. And Nicole.
Well, I'm definitely going to write down all this advice. I think one of the things that I've been saying to myself throughout this, and kind of getting all these curveballs, was the Bear Grylls quote: improvise, adapt, overcome. Just because everything has been so up in the air. And then I think my last piece of advice is just, art's supposed to be fun. You're supposed to enjoy it. And whether you're enjoying going through these really deep feelings, or you're enjoying making something kind of wacky that's going to disturb the neighborhood, it's supposed to be fun.
It's true. Thank you so much for leaving us with that positive piece of wisdom, Nicole. And we are out of time. I'm going to hand it back over to Janine. Thank you so much, panelists. This is a really great conversation.
What a wonderful conversation. Thank you to our panel for sharing your experiences with us today, and Chris for moderating the conversation. From all of us at Western Washington University and the College of Fine and Performing Arts, we want to thank you for joining us today. We also want to thank the Western Alumni Association for their partnership for this webinar. Please consider supporting our students on Give Day. It's this Thursday, May 27th, and I'm going to post the URL just now in the chat. Your support makes a tremendous difference for our students. The recording for this webinar will be emailed out within the week. Please check your email for that link, and feel free to share it with others who may not have been able to join us today. Thank you again to our terrific panel, and we hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thanks everyone for coming. Bye.
Bye.